The joy that you find here you borrow. You cannot keep it long, it seems. But gigolo and gigolette still sing a song and dance along the boulevard of broken dreams.
Everyone who lived through the Great Depression has a story to tell. Stay with us as ordinary people recall extraordinary times in Pennsylvania.
By the summer of 1932, things were at their worst. And this was the president of the First National Bank actually thought the bank were going to fail. And he was lamenting that fact in correspondence. Even the bank couldn't pay its bills. The Bellefonte Trust Company, which is now Mid-State Bank, their employees were down in the cellar in the evenings taking target practice with actual weapons. They were afraid there was going to be a run on the bank or mass civil disturbance.
Pennsylvania felt the impact of the Great Depression unevenly. Cities dependent on trade and industry were devastated. Rural areas fared better, at least there people could eat. But no town or hamlet escaped, and ultimately no person was left untouched.
I would say I noticed it first in 1931. That was, I came back from Pittsburgh and went to work in Dad's grocery store. And by then, people were beginning to hurt because we had back at that time what they called overseers of the poor. And Bellefonte Borough had one. And we used to get food slips allowing these people to purchase a certain amount in dollars, and then the borough would take care of it later on.
Between 1930 and 1933, 9,000 American banks closed. Depositors lost $2.5 billion.
Well, as a child, I had some doting grandparents that would give me $1 every now and then, and I had a bank, and we weren't allowed to spend that money. We had to put it in a bank. And, I don't recall now how much money I might have had, maybe $350. But I entered college in 1930, right around the time when everything was so bad and banks were closing, and I lost all my childhood savings.
Business failures and unemployment spread. Those lucky enough to keep their jobs often found their hours and wages cut. For others, there simply were no jobs to be had.
When the Depression hit, of course, everything slacked off. And I remember that we worked 3 and 4 days a week for quite a while.
I was working for the Bell Telephone of Pennsylvania, which is no more. And of course, it was a 40-hour week, and they had more or less contracted that they would not have any layoffs. They tried their very best to avoid it. But instead of that, why, for a while, they cut down to a 36-hour week, and then later on a 32-hour week, which of course affected the paycheck that much.
I remember my husband, he was just my beau at the time, came to where I lived on State Street, Dr. Zimmerman's, and he said he was going to Philadelphia, see if he could get a freighter out for some work. And I said, no, you better not go. And he said, well, I have to go. There's no work around here. So I offered him money to go, and he said, no. He said, I've got a few cents on me. And he hitchhiked to Philadelphia, and he was there for about a week. And there was he couldn't get a boat out. They weren't hiring. And he came back, he still had 2 cents. And I said, well, how did you do it? He said, well, people were good. They had kitchens. You got some soup. He said, it wasn't like Mother would make it home, but he said, I lived on it.
Pennsylvanians adjusted to the hard times as best they could. Thrown back on their own resources, they tightened their belts and found ways to cope.
Many families moved together at the time of the Depression, especially young married couples who had just started their own homes, had to give up their homes and move in with their families.
One thing I can remember that we had 5 children in my family. I was the 4th or 5th, and we never were allowed to eat a full banana. I was probably 30 or 35 years old before I would eat a whole banana. We would eat half a banana, and you always left some for your brothers and sisters.
I remember a party giving us a ham bone, and some of my neighbors maybe had a few beans or something. Well, we'd put this stuff together, and the 2 or 3 families would eat. We would have a meal.
And during that time, we canned all of our own meat and fruit and vegetables. We had a 3-burner kerosene stove that we canned on. And my husband and his uncle went up in the mountain and trailed down logs and sawed up for our... So for 3 years, it didn't cost us anything for our fuel, which was a great help.
Well, everything was self-sufficient. They didn't have food stamp programs in those days, so what they did was give people burpee seeds. And we gave half of the backyard was turned into a garden, and people who had no land would come here and plant a garden, and in that way they got half of the food which they raised, and they gave us the other half for providing the land.
Churches helped, YMCAs and people of that sort, Salvation Army.
Salvation Army was one.
Helped with food and things of that sort.
You had what you had, and you had it, you had it, and if you didn't, you did without it.
Guido Valentino was a teenager in Altoona. Until the Depression hit, he had planned to work for the railroad.
That was everybody's ambition, to get in the railroad. But needless and sad to say, I never got to that railroad till 1939.
Instead of working the rails, Guido rode them, joining thousands of young men crisscrossing the country in search of work.
We rode the passenger trains. Now, passenger trains, not too many hobos really became too good at it, because you had to be athletic, you had to be strong, because you had to catch them on the move pulling out of a station. And the station, there was always railroad bulls around. Well, you got caught, they'd take you down to the local jail and keep you for, I've been in many jails across the country, because I've been in, at that time it was only 48 states, we made all of them.
Someone asked a noted economist in the early 30s if any historical era compared with the Great Depression. Yes, he replied, the Dark Ages, and it lasted 400 years. By 1932, people were desperate for change. Pennsylvania voted for Herbert Hoover that year, but the revolution put in place by Franklin Roosevelt made the Democratic Party a viable presence in the state for the first time in generations. 4 years later, Pennsylvania joined the Roosevelt landslide.
Well, everybody expected a change. They really did. That's what they voted for, was a change, and that's what they got. They got plenty of it.
What do I think about Roosevelt? Well, I guess I thought a lot of him in those days, and I think I still do. I know my parents died in the old Republicans, and I voted, he was the first president I ever voted for, and I voted for him as a registered Republican. So that my dad didn't like very well.
Well, Roosevelt was different. There was just no doubt about it. And the people were in such financial and physical conditions back at that time that they were willing to try most anything.
There was hope then. I know I had young brothers, and they found work, you know, in these camps and things like that, that otherwise was try to find something to eat.
I remember that very vaguely of President Hoover who everyone seemed to think was a good man, but more or less ineffectual. And when Franklin Delano Roosevelt took over and said, "My friends," that it sort of inspired people to take new hope in life, right. And that they all pulled together and with the help of everybody trying and the help of the good Lord, the Franklin Roosevelt was the inspiration to pull out of the Depression, in my opinion.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.